Thank you for coming. This will be a very informal, I hope wide-ranging conversation about not just the book, which I think is easily the best book written about the catastrophe that so many of us lived through, but also the new documentary that's doing so well, and politics and the gay community and all the rest of it all together. I want to start with simply a simple question, which is that if I had come along to you in like the late 80s or maybe early 90s and said that in 2017 you and I will be sitting here, we'll both be alive, having this conversation, and almost no one under 40 in the gay community could give a shit. Would you have been thrilled by that or depressed?
Well, I guess the first shock would be that we are here, and that certainly wasn't anticipated or expected. So the rest would have been hypothetical after that. It is disappointing that this history hasn't easily transmitted through the generations, but I know why. I mean, because a generation of gay men disappeared. I remember when I first moved to New York, I was 20 years old, and I had friends who were in generations above me, who brought me into the community and taught me the tricks and schooled me in camp. I had the education that brought me into the idiom of gay life and the belly of gay life and the ebb and flow of it. And the gay community under 40, gay men under 40 didn't have that. And I think there's a whole different culture there that looks at our generation as kind of anachronistic, something from the past. And they throw us in with AIDS itself, like something that was a kind of a bad and ugly period, and we represent that. And I think in a way people stay away from us because they want to stay away from that and enjoy a more, fearless life, which they can enjoy because of the work that we did and the work that science did. And that part I celebrate, that life can be so easy and inconsequential. I just don't like being considered the consequence.
Right. And you're right, of course, there is this, for me anyway, there's this amazement that it ended. And sense of unreality that really we're now, 50-something ordinary people, but also that the energy and dynamism and that came out of that AIDS crisis was clearly also instrumental in the civil rights revolution that followed. But weirdly, of course, that civil rights revolution was I wonder whether that generation that died would have resisted it. You see, I think that one reason that those of us who came into the gay rights movement in sort of the late 80s, early 90s, and were regarded as sort of integrationists and assimilationists and conservatives, which we were in some respects. Mm-hmm. I don't think assimilationists would be right, integrationists.
Right.
We had a huge struggle with that generation who really despised what we were trying to do. And this is a weird irony of it, that if they had lived, there would have been a war, a much bigger war within the gay community about the future. Right? So in some ways, there's a really mixed feeling that it's amazing that we got where we got. And yet the price of getting where we got is to forget everything that happened.
Well, and it really is disorienting. I was coming out in the late 70s, early 80s, and what I was being invited to join was a group of outlaws, and that was cool. It was
I had the
remarkable.
Opposite response. I was like, I don't want to be an outlaw. It's not cool.
I wanted to be special suddenly and finally, after years of being repressed, and being condemned. And I came up as a kid through a violent period. Like I was scared through my childhood. It was extremely violent.
What are you referring to exactly?
Life as a teenager in the Midwest in the 70s as a faggy gay boy.
Okay.
And you know, I got to New York and I was special. You know, we were outlaws. We were better. We had developed a kind of an ethos and politic that was unique, and there was the idea coming from the movement in the 70s, and it had traction in the early 80s, that what we were creating was something brand new. We didn't want to be in the army. We didn't want to be married. We wanted to create our own institutions and our own families and our own systems, and then to go from outlaws to in-laws was a really unexpected journey, and it seemed to happen overnight, because you know, here we are struggling with survival itself, and then we come out the other end and we're engaged, and all of that entailed, without ever really those of us who, I guess, older than you, who really embraced that outsider perspective.
Right. I think I was more of a transitional generation. So that we weren't really, when we came to terms with our own sexual orientation, in our teens or, you know, early adulthood, AIDS was already a fixture.
Right.
So that we grew up fearing this thing as the ultimate punishment, which is how, of course, one thought. And one of the things I found interesting about the book, I mean, honest about the book, was your grappling with that, because in some ways, obviously, when this plague hit, it could not but have the implications of what Buchanan and other people said, you know, which this is obviously punishment. You've had this brief period, really, in the history of, I mean, if homosexuals have been around as long as human beings have, this is a minuscule, tiny fraction of a second in which suddenly there's this liberation. And then almost as soon as it happens, there's this...
Right. Divine retribution for a filthy vice, I think he called it.
Yeah, so he then said that the gays have waged war on nature, and nature is having its revenge.
Right.
How did people not internalize that? I mean, they probably did, right? Everybody did at some level, right? Part of me wonders whether some of the extraordinary theatricality and rhetorical extremism backed up was partly a function of suppressing exactly that fear. You know, it's a reaction formation. We're so terrified that we are actually being exposed as people worthy of being damned that we're going to have to completely reverse that. We're going to have to go even more in the other direction.
Yeah, I think that's true. You know, but you know, before that backlash, we had that backlash. I mean, I was, you know, understanding who I was at a time when the simple response was electroshock therapy. Right. So there was no moment of innocence for a lot of people who were in New York at the time when the plague hit. And there was, I talk about it in the book, although there's no social science on this, but there was probably the most massive migration of gay people in world history was taking place in the 70s. After the Stonewall Rebellion, the beginning of the modern movement, everybody was fleeing, heading to the cities. Now, it had happened earlier after World War II, when people were demobilized and stayed in their port cities, but this was people coming to New York and LA and San Francisco and elsewhere to build this community, to actually be, and here, and to consciously build a community of a ghetto community. And
wasn't that actually also, in some respects, a fatal error? Because what it did, I mean,
it made what they call
concentrated everybody, so that if a virus were to happen, it would spread extremely quickly.
A magnification system, the epidemiologists call it. But yeah, it was totally ripe for something like that to happen. And although the people who put out the call for ACT UP, the kind of, I think, ground-changing activism in the epidemic, were people from older generations, were people like Larry Kramer, who had been around since the late 50s. The people who answered the call were a half a generation behind me. People who didn't feel that kind of fear of electroshock. They hadn't been taken into aversion therapy as I had been.
You went through that process?
Yeah. And they had a belief.
When did that happen?
In college, in the 70s. So they had a belief that they were Americans, and they were shocked that they weren't getting what an American should get. And I think that'd be more Peter Staley. Peter Staley and kind of that generation. Now Peter's a year or two younger than I am, but he came out much later.
Right.
And I think the people that really began to follow what was happening in ACT UP were born in the mid-'60s and late '60s, and they were shocked that the government wasn't doing anything. And there was a kind of a righteous indignation, whereas I think my age and older thought, well, of course they're not doing anything, and that we didn't expect them to do anything. I think it took the combination of those perspectives to begin to realize that the ghetto was a dangerous place, and that the only way to find a way to survival was to build bridges over those walls that we had spent so many years erecting, and to make our way back to America.
Right. And that was, of course, the beginning, in some ways, of the integrationist movement.
Right.
That the recognition that ghettos were actually insufficient, that you couldn't wall yourself off in society, because something like this could happen.
Right.
And and also the fact that we needed families in this period too, that you were not, you both needed them and also were terrified of them, because so many would come in.
You mean biological families?
Biological families.
I don't know. Did we need them? I mean, they were part of the problem.
Well, that's the other thing I think. We recognized that we were legally next of kin in certain ways, and that made a big difference. Mm-hmm. And that if we were going to get the entire society to shift, we're going to have to deal with our own families as well as the broader community, which completely shifted the direction of gay politics, insofar as there had ever been a gay politics to some extent.
Right.
But this was an incredibly fast catch-up, right? I mean,
it was 15 years. It was crazy. It was probably the most rapid cultural transformation of its kind in history. And I mean, it happened so quickly that most of us didn't even notice it happening, because we were engaged in all the work on the ground that was making those advances without necessarily knowing what it was all going to amount to.
Was it?
And it amounted to will and grace, and we went, what the hell? Like, is that what we had in mind?
I think it's what a lot of gay men who hadn't gone to the cities, who were,
right.
It is what they had in mind, actually. Right. It's what they dreamed of. And that was what was interesting about the politics of that period. There was considerable tension within that. But for me, at least, and one maybe I'll pose this to you, that it, in some ways, because, AIDS made the gay question unavoidable. It was on the evening. I mean, I think what people, this audience is old enough to remember that it just wasn't spoken of. There was this incredible missing conversation. And suddenly this disease mandated, because it was obviously news and could threaten heterosexuals, at least that was the original panic. Right. So suddenly it was talked about, which in itself changes the culture, right? That it immediately changed. Secondly, of course,
it's the culture that was talked about, because we were talked about, but always in the crime blotters. We were dragged out of toilets. We were found behind schools. We were criminals, and those are the only stories that we were allowed to read about ourselves.
Right. So in fact, being victims of a disease was a step up.
It was.
In terms of the general consciousness of what it was that gay men were, which is sort of that's the other thing we are talking at this point about gay men. It wasn't that people were discussing lesbians. Lesbians were critical in the reaction and the resistance to this, but this was lesbians weren't dying of HIV in the way that
thank God, because that gave the lie to the divine retribution theory, because lesbians were the least likely people in the world to get HIV. And so, I
remember having to make that point many times.
Yeah.
And it was a good point, but somehow it didn't ever get through. It somehow it didn't. I mean, I tried. I mean, I remember debating Buchanan on this, and it's like, well, according to you, then, lesbians should be the most, divinely blessed group on planet Earth.
Right.
And
they didn't count. There was no anal penetration. So.
Yes, exactly. But also, of course, there was something. I mean, what the images of the dying, which were and remain shocking. I think all of us who went through the experience of watching people we loved go through that death, which was not. I mean, I think one of the things that the book really helps remind people: this was not an easy death. This was some sort of medieval torture of a death. And in some ways, I think the pathos of that people may be homophobic, or they may have ick, or they hadn't thought about it very much. But the image of these, I mean, that famous image of the almost Christ-like figure in his
father's arms.
That also weirdly touched people. I mean, your generation might have thought no one would ever give a shit, but they did in the end. Mm-hmm. They did. It took a while,
right?
Partly because that culture was so different. But they did, and to some extent, doesn't that say good things about Americans in general in that period? I mean, there's plenty of bad things to be said, but isn't it also true that they did rally around, that people did understand this was a terrible thing that happened to people? They were not arbitrarily cruel. I mean, there were individual instances, but the general culture wasn't like, screw you guys, you deserved every bit of that KS, every bit of that crypto that's starving you to death.
Except in poll after poll, that's exactly what they said.
Yeah.
Into the 80s, into the mid 80s, into the late 80s.
Right.
I think 1989, even doctors in polls where they didn't have to identify themselves said that they would prefer not to take care of a person with HIV or AIDS. So they did feel that. Then they changed.
Yeah.
And I think that that's probably the first of the victories of ACT UP. And ACT UP was formed in '87, 6 years into the epidemic, and the first thing that they realized they needed to do was to control to market gay men. They had to sell gay men as humans and to establish the humanity of people who were suffering. And they did it with all the techniques that were used to sell Madonna and Coca-Cola and luxury vehicles, and they knew how to do that because they were selling Madonna and Coca-Cola and luxury vehicles. They came from those worlds. They came from media. They came from marketing. They came from message control. They came with skills that they found a way to put to the task of changing culture. And those victories, I mean, 2 years before that is Rock Hudson's death, which got people to talk, at least for the first time in the American conversation about AIDS and its tolls. But it wasn't until ACT UP started kind of creating the images and creating the...
What image are you thinking of?
Well, they began with kind of the graphics, okay? They started with a kind of graphical imagery that worked in the community, that saw their posters, that saw their...
But that's not straight people.
Well, it would be straight people inside their cities, for example. Those images were mobilizing the gay community, but they were also kind of taking messages outside of the gay community. And then they started doing things like the first big demonstration at the FDA. They used the techniques of mass market communications. They lined people up from each state, and when they ran into a reporter at the demonstration from Indianapolis, they would find somebody from Indianapolis so that they could get the hometown angle on the story. And they started planting AIDS stories in cities and towns across the country. And they started winning on the idea that what they were creating a kind of a boy next door image, right? So in a way they were kind of sanitizing the image of the urban gay community and taking it back home.
So in some ways, paradoxically, ACT UP was actually, in that sense, culturally conservative.
Mm-hmm. It was.
It was, along with, at the same time, of course, the beginnings of the marriage movement and the military question, which emerged late 80s, early 90s. But it's funny you say that. I mean, it's not something that most people would the other thing that people felt with ACT UP was that it was, to a lot of middle-class Americans, really kind of shocking and did things that they really, I mean, I remember at the time thinking, if we want to get people to really rally behind more research or whatever, do we really want to shut down the Brooklyn Bridge?
Right.
Ruin everybody's commute? Do we really want to disrupt a TV news show? Do we really want to go into St. Patrick's Cathedral and violate the sacred? Now that was, in your book as well, a turning point in a way, when they realized that that's not going to help, right?
They didn't all realize that, but I think the net effect was that things had gotten out of control and that they had lost control of their members and control of the message. And it was the beginning of the end of ACT UP, I believe, because it exposed the fault lines between the conservative arm of the movement and the radical arm of the movement. And the conservative arm did not want to dismantle Big Pharma. They wanted to empower Big Pharma. They wished for runaway profits for Big Pharma. They didn't want to take apart the NIH. They wanted to empower it. They were right, weren't they? It worked, and in that case, in that measure,
which is their only measure.
They're right, and it worked where the other one couldn't because there was no time. I mean, if the other arm, which wanted to establish, single-payer universal health care, wanted to challenge capitalism itself, wanted to take away profit motive from drug research. If they had won the day,
we'd still be waiting.
We'd still be waiting. And most of the people who were in ACT UP with HIV, and the divide was also along that line, those were the conservative people, they'd be dead.
Right.
And so that conservative wing knew that they needed to save their own lives and didn't have room for these kind of larger idealistic approaches, which they may have agreed with, but strategically they had no time for.
They understood that, the final breakthrough, I mean, with Merck's protease inhibitors was private, publicly traded drug companies doing the basic research. One question that I've never fully resolved in my own mind, and your book didn't quite resolve it for me either, so I'm going to try and get you to resolve it now. Did the AIDS activism actually accelerate the arrival of the cocktail therapy, or really, when you look at it, the evidence that the activism generated research into cures for the opportunistic infections is thoroughly documented in your book, and I think is completely. So I should look at you guys. Is I think pretty obvious, and obviously that was a huge. People forget that was hugely important. I mean, you're struggling with crypto. It's. You're running on a conveyor belt that's coming in the wrong direction. But this process, this long process, scientific process of research, was going to take time. You couldn't rush it, or you could try. There were, in any research, there are going to be lots of blind alleys, right? I mean, even in the best intentioned. The virus wasn't itself really isolated or detected until years into the actual epidemic. Is the narrative that the gay community has told about itself that without ACT UP there would be all these people would have died? Is that true?
Well, there's so much there, right?
Yeah, I know.
So what are people dying of? They're dying of the opportunistic infections. Right. And so the work that was being done even from 1981, 1982 forward, that was treatment activism, was geared toward ending the dying. And it eventually slowed down the dying, at least from pneumocystis pneumonia. That was
Bactrim.
Bactrim and pentamidine. And that was the main killer. That was killing 70% of all the early cases. And it was just a logical conclusion that those drugs would prevent the disease. It was known, I mean, this is how ridiculously behind we were. It was known that if you had immune suppression from organ transplant and you were taking medication to keep from rejecting those organs, that you were susceptible to pneumocystis pneumonia and you would die from pneumocystis pneumonia. And it was practiced since the early 70s to prevent that pneumonia. We knew it was utterly preventable. And what no one was doing was applying that knowledge to HIV, the AIDS epidemic. It's a simple step to say, if it worked there, it worked here. And the federal research establishment resisted that, resisted all the people going to them, Michael Callan going to them, begging the NIH to put out a treatment alert to save lives. And Tony Fauci, who was in charge of HIV research then and is now, rejected those pleas over and over and over, year after year, because he said there was no research. There's no way to know if these drugs work the same in gay people as other people. Now, there's no physical difference between gay people and other people.
So now Tony Fauci is...
And by the time he finally made that decision, 16,000 people had died of AIDS between the first time that Michael Callan went to him and said, do this on PCP, issue this alert, and the time when he finally issued the alert, 16,000 people had died. He never once took on a study. He didn't commission, even in his own laboratory, the study he kept saying was missing in order to make that proclamation.
Because Tony Fauci, I mean, he's a mixed human being, but he's also is a hero in many respects as well in this epidemic. I've met him, you've met him, and incredibly smart guy. Why? What was going on there? I mean, he's not a bigot. He was not a fool.
No.
He wasn't ignorant. So what was the blockage there?
He's a politician. He's a politician. He has run that enterprise like a politician over all of these years.
Why would it hurt a politician to get a treatment for PCP?
Here's the way he explained it, and he explained it in rooms like this where everybody sitting in front of him had HIV. Mm-hmm. He said, it sounds like an academic approach, but I am not going to tell people what to research. I think, philosophically, academically, the best research generates from laboratories and the curiosity of individual scientists, and they bring it up. So I'm not going to direct anybody. I run the biggest budget for AIDS research in the world. I'm not going to put out RFPs for people to study this disease or that opportunistic infection or that. And no one has come to me to propose this study about whether or not gay people have the same bodies as straight people when it comes to taking this prophylaxis. Now, and the reason nobody did that is because there's no glory in it. There's no, why would anybody do that except out of humanitarian responses? And the academic researchers that he was working with didn't have enough connection with the AIDS population to have a kind of a human response. They were academics, right. And so he was holding to this strange Ivy Tower idea for years when he knew what the consequences of that were, and he was confronted on a regular basis by people who blamed him for these deaths and brought to him the new number the next year and the new number the next year of the deaths that he was refusing to prevent by either commissioning that study or simply issuing that treatment alert to doctors around the country so that they would know how to do this.
Some doctors were already doing it, of course, right? I mean,
right. There were, let's say, a dozen or a dozen and a half AIDS doctors in New York City who were smart enough to know how to do that, and probably a dozen in San Francisco and elsewhere. But there was no way to communicate these ideas except through the medical journals, and the medical journals were reporting the results of trials, and the trials weren't happening. So there wasn't there was no internet to spill this information out. And after a while, I was working back then at a gay community newspaper, a weekly called the New York Native, and the New York Native in the early half decade of the epidemic was the only place where you could get this information, the anecdotal information, the suppositions of clinicians, and the insights of researchers, and scientists around the country and doctors around the country started subscribing to this paper that always, appeared with men in jockstraps on the front page. But inside it had this fundamental, across the board scientific coverage. And if you didn't have the nerve to put that newspaper in your waiting room, then you're not getting that information. And
right.
So so that information didn't get around. And that's a real crime, And I think I spell it out pretty plainly in the book. I think that Tony Fauci deserves to be held to account for that, and he finds ways to avoid that, over and over.
But in those rooms, he was held accountable.
And he said he spoke about it as though it were out of his hands. This is the way science is done.
Right. I'm going to bring up two characters. Different characters in this book. I mean, the book is, what I love about the book is that it doesn't present a sort of banal, heroic, everybody is on the one side is a good person, everybody on the other side is a bad person. It's a complicated moment. And two complicated people. One, and what I think your book does in a way that no previous book has done is, if I'm going to put it bluntly, put Larry Kramer in his place, which he won't forgive the documentary for, but which was that, and I'll what I got from it, maybe which is that it was indispensable to have that particular point of passion in this, but that he was also so difficult to work with and so divisive and so unnecessarily antagonistic that he also set things back at the same time. I think people who've only gone to see that play, why am I blanking on the name of it?
Normal Heart.
Normal Heart, which was a brilliant piece of propaganda for himself, wouldn't really get an idea of what was happening or who really was doing this. Am I misrepresenting that, or is there anything you want to add about that? Or
well, let me think about whether or not I want to subtract something. I don't know that Larry Kramer held things back. I think that Larry Kramer did all of the wrong things, and it all worked. And I think there's something really remarkable about that. Yeah. That he did some right things, and some of the things he intended to do were correct. But I think a lot of what he did was had these unintended positive consequences. And I think that's.
Can you give one example of that, just to?
I think that's remarkable. Well, his formation of ACT UP was really to create an army of people to go and fight gay men's health crisis. Right. So he was building his own army so that he could go in there and take his seat back at gay men's health crisis.
Right.
And the army itself had other ideas.
Right.
Which charmed him and thrilled him, but it was
mainly getting back at those people.
It didn't get him back on the throne.
Right.
Which I think he was trying to do, and his constant wars with gay men's health crisis were pointless or personal or full of revenge, but they created a new kind of activism that succeeded. And that's what I think is I think when history judges, and I tried to be history judging Larry Kramer, I think that he should be given credit for the success, and he should be faithfully studied to find out how he did it. Because what if that's the way to do these things, you know? Like, what if...
Try and do the opposite and
Try to do the opposite and then see what happens. And, you know, I think that so much, and maybe even most of what happened in AIDS activism, which is so central and so new and so powerful, is thanks to Larry Kramer. But if you look at his playbook, it wouldn't make sense.
Yeah, except, let me push back a little bit on that. I mean, I do think in some ways, I mean, a lot of things that ACT UP did clearly changed. Certainly in terms of, for example, the patient-doctor relationship, which was crucial. And those of us who, you know, took a whole different approach to medicine. But the ratcheting up of rhetoric to a point where I mean, I see this right now with where the left is today on campuses. The ratcheting up of rhetoric and attacks on people, calling them murderers when they're... I mean, I had a long conversation once with Larry, actually it's in print, trying to get him to concede the difference between an act of commission and an act of omission. This is something he could not understand. In that sense, there was no non-zero sum. It was always zero sum, rather like our president. You know, there's always, and the alienation of people, both the attacks, and the attacks tended to come on the people on your side, most viciously, right? And that's also the case now, that people are you're hounding liberal professors because they haven't subscribed to critical race theory sufficiently enough, and trying to get them fired, personally attacking them, surrounding them, that kind of tactic, that we don't care, we're not going to be fair to people because the ends justify the means. I think that's a dangerous precedent. I think it has ramifications on both sides of the spectrum, both left and right, in as much as these radicalization of both sides currently has some of its roots in this decision to not even decide you're going to be part of a rational argument, but you're going to actually offensively attack and smear and describe people in ways that's clearly unfair.
Yes. But Larry did it in a weird way, right? Okay. So Larry would call, and did in print, call Tony Fauci a murderer. And the next time they met, they were like best girlfriends. You know, he had this way of creating. I don't know if I have the words to describe it. He created the celebrity of Larry Kramer, and he used that celebrity to call names, often to say remarkably inappropriate things, like calling for terrorism and worse at the San Francisco International AIDS Conference. Actually on television saying it is time for terrorism. And at the same time becoming incredibly chummy with the people who were the targets of his ire. He and Tony Fauci are best friends and have been for decades now. And so that's what I mean about doing the wrong thing and somehow getting the right thing to happen. Now, he didn't radicalize anybody. You know, he didn't. His rhetoric moved things forward somehow in a very remarkable way, like a very unanticipated way. You know, I gave when the book came off the presses, I went over to Larry's apartment and gave it to him, and I said, "You're going to hate this. You're just going to hate this book." At first, but I think you're going to come to like it, because I think I've tried to figure out exactly how you did what you did. And there's no question about what you did, what you accomplished. I don't think I don't think anybody's questioned that. But I wanted to seriously delve into how he did it, what his secrets were. And so I'm not a student of the left on campuses as you're describing them today, but I don't think what he created was a movement of irrational political backlash.
Tell me, moving on, the experience of those of us who thought we might die and who witnessed the death of, in our own social circles, of just unprecedented numbers of people historically. What's it like to live now? I mean, one of the postscripts of your book is how many of those who were heroic in all of this, once the immediate threat was over, disappeared into depression, into addiction. The crystal meth epidemic seemed to have a particularly broad swath within, I would be almost the dead center of that generation. There was this, I mean, I remember that the first time in my life I actually had a clinical depression was after my viral load went to 0. And I had no idea why I was feeling those things. But this is a personal question as well. How does one, when one has lived that, when you and I mean, you more acutely in the middle of this, I don't want to in any way detract from that. You lived through this event. You lived through not just this mass death of young people, which again is particularly traumatizing. And they're all gone, and you're still here. And at the same time, you've also, if you've lived as we have, you've also witnessed this incredible political revolution in which when we thought we were going to have mass extinction, we actually have mass enfranchisement at the end of it.
Right.
And now the subject we're talking about is a bore to the very successes. How do we, as our generation, carry on? What do we do with all? I mean, we're obviously thriving. But you had to do, in some ways, you thrive because you tackled this stuff. You immerse yourself to get through it. I mean, I don't know psychologically how that worked, but in some ways it felt to me, reading the book, as if this was the therapy for you too. Maybe you tell us about those of us who survived and what we do, because we've now got, I don't know, 20 years more to live. What's that like?
Well, I can speak about it personally and from my observation. You know, there's this notion of what people are calling AIDS survivor syndrome, ASS. It was named after Spencer Cox, who died in '92. Obviously, a victim of AIDS survivor syndrome, and his friends wanted to start a foundation called Spencer Cox's Ass Foundation in his honor, and Spencer Cox had an ass worth raising money for. You know, the book looks at people who were right on the front lines, and the people who were closest to battle, who had given up everything in their lives but that battle, who devoted everything to it, were totally fucking disoriented afterwards. And, you know, they had no idea what to do. And they had not built careers necessarily. They had not built bank accounts, especially the people who were HIV positive and fighting through that period, and I never seroconverted myself. You know, one of the joys of knowing we were dying back then was to run up credit cards. You know, we were trying to find the silver lining. You know, we were registering for health. For life insurance policies and selling them, and registering again and selling them, and you know, getting away with shit, pulling something out of this, and then to come out the other end and suddenly be have no income, have no career. You're suddenly, you know, mid 30s, late 30s, early 40s, and you got nothing except a huge amount of debt that suddenly you can't just walk away from. And and you don't have the sense of purpose and mobilization that you had before then. Like, you know, I guess victory is disorienting, and it certainly screwed up a lot of people who were right there doing all of that work. You know, I actually started on this project because in, I guess it was 2008, I ran into like one of the hero doctors of that time, Gabriel Torres, who had been the clinician who started the AIDS ward, set up the AIDS ward at St. Vincent's Hospital, which was the hospital at the epicenter of New York's epidemic. And he was an incredible, heroic figure. And at the time, St. Vincent's was, you know, run by nuns who were slapping people's wrists if they brought in their boyfriends, and boyfriends weren't allowed to visit their dying lovers. And he created this safe space, and then he set up a research institution there, and he actually was one of the principal investigators on the protease inhibitors, on Crixivan, the drug that made such a difference. And on top of that, he was a internationally known speaker, and he was gorgeous. Like, he was gorgeous. I was at conferences where he would walk in the room and the conference would stop and people would applaud just from his gait, you know, as he got up to the stage. And there he was in 2008, homeless, drug addicted, facing multiple felony charges. He had lost his license, and he was the most miserable of characters, and I wondered what the hell happened to him. Like, it's just 12 years after you know, the drug revolution, after the end of the plague, and what happened to him, and how could, and what was that thing inside of him that did that, and what was the thing in the community that allowed that to happen? And that's why I wanted to go back and look at these years in large part to try and measure the strange psychological twisting that survival entailed.
On my part, it was just a matter of channeling it into the campaign for military service and for marriage equality. That was a kind of way in which some of us decided that we're going to get something, not just ending something, but we wanted to achieve something out of this. Because in fact, the kind of unity of purpose, the politicization in some ways of gay men, we were right in as much as it was a flame in a bottle. It was not going to last.
Right.
And you see it today. I mean, in some ways, it's a good thing. People in a free society shouldn't have to be political. I mean, they want to just live their lives. But without that, and now that that's over, I think there is a real. You're right. I mean, what did happen to that? Oh, good God! I'm sorry. I put this on airplane mode. I did.
What happened to Gabe Torres?
Yes.
Is that him calling? He has phone privileges, but he's in federal prison. He had the charges that he was facing at the time that I wrote about him for New York Magazine were forgiven as much as could be possible, but it didn't solve his underlying problems, which were drug addiction and ass. He had ass and all the rest, and so he had ultimately was charged in multiple states, in Puerto Rico as well, with running of some sort. He was not right. He wasn't right. And methamphetamines changes you in really fundamental ways. And he had been over a decade abusing that drug, or
well,
if I don't mean to use the word abusing, but it was abusing him for over a decade. And now he's been in federal prison for many, many years. And I haven't spoken to him recently, but I understand that he has really found a way to recapture his kind of intellectual capacity. He's writing now, he's advising research initiatives, and he's doing it all from a prison in Texas.
Wow. In some ways that's encouraging, at least, that he's not.
Well, it got him well.
Right.
You know, it got him well, and brought him to a new place. And maybe all the work that happened after my article came out in New York Magazine, because the whole community got together around him, and they wrote letters to judges, and they, you know, tried to do what they could to get this guy to not go to jail. Maybe that was the wrong move.
Right. I'm going to open this now to you guys for a few minutes, because I'm sure there are questions you might have to ask David.
What do you think about the fact that the fastest growing population for HIV/AIDS in the country is adolescents and young adults?
Right. Well, it's even more refined than that. It's ages 13 to 21, right,
Yeah.
or 24. People of color, mostly African Americans, and a large portion of them are transgender. So, and they're in the South. There are parts of the country that are unreached by health care and a population, subpopulation that is ignored by medicine for the most part. So, what I think is that we've got a lot of work to do to get to that. We've got to find ways to reach those communities, and nobody's doing that. Certainly the CDC is not doing that. Most of the national AIDS organizations aren't doing that. They're not extending their operations to the areas where the large number of transmissions are taking place. And because there's nobody down there putting these people on treatment, they're transmitting and transmitting and transmitting without knowing what's happening, and they don't get their diagnoses for the most part until they already have full-blown AIDS. Nobody should have AIDS anymore. And they don't learn that they're HIV infected until they get to the hospital with one of the opportunistic infections we know how to prevent.
Right.
So I think it's a tragedy. I mean, it's a real failure.
Ma'am.
Thank you also for the book.
Thank you.
Can you tell us a little bit about what you're working on now?
Thank you. I was
project?
just to ask that question, and I'm glad you did. This new documentary, tell us all about it.
I've just finished a new doc. Was that me? Was that?
It's just a pen.
Just a pen.
With Laura Teodosio, who's over here, my producer, on the early transgender rights activists, Marsha Johnson and Sylvia Rivera. It's called The Death and Life of Marsha P. Johnson. And we premiered it in Tribeca a couple of weeks ago, and we're bringing it here to the film festival in 2 weeks. So you'll get a chance to see it. And just today we announced that we sold it to Netflix. So.
The Native was courageous in many respects because it relied a lot on advertising from bathhouses, you know, the places that were actually unwittingly promoting us. Although The Native has an interesting story too, in your book, Chuck Ortleb, hero becomes completely nuts. I mean, I remember because I had to deal with him at the New Republic. What is your take on the New York Times of that period and its coverage?
Well, I'll just explain what the coverage was to begin with from the New York Times. The very first report in the Times of this disease that was seeming to target gay men was buried on page 23, and it was a double truck page of advertising with one little column on the corner about this thing that was killing 41 people, mostly in New York, and it really over the next 6, 7, 8 years never developed an appetite for covering the disease. We now know that the editor had a particular dislike for gay people. The paper itself had an editorial policy, a style book, a rule that prohibited the use of the word gay to describe gay people. We were always homosexuals. They refused to name our partners in our obituaries. And it was only after years of pressure that they decided that they would name like longtime companions, which was a kind of a spongy phrase that made us seem odd. And they were active in trying to present the community as being other. And it wasn't until people inside the paper started getting sick that we started to see some real change there. There was Jeffrey Smaltz, who was one of the journalists there, collapsed one day in the office and was diagnosed with AIDS, and he was a beloved member of the staff, and so that kind of began a transformation. I should say in the newspaper's defense that no other newspaper in the country was doing much better. The San Francisco Chronicle was marginally better in the early years, and like there were.
Was that just Randy?
They hired Randy for that job, so Randy did it, but it was their idea consciously to bring him in to do that. But nobody else was doing it either. You couldn't find any AIDS news on national television. There were an occasional, the first primetime news special was a Geraldo Rivera expose of AIDS. And although everything about it was correct, it was great that he did it, it was still Geraldo Rivera style. And it seemed, it just made it, it added oil to the presentation of the whole thing.
Given that, one of the interesting things about your book, given that culture at the time, which spread, which was universal in many ways, with liberal institutions, conservative institutions.
We didn't exist.
Democrats and Republicans.
Right.
Would any president of any party would they have acted in any way differently than Reagan did?
I don't know. I don't know. Okay, let's think about it this way. So Reagan is brought to power on the wings of the Christian right, which didn't really exist before as a political power or political force.
Partly. They weren't. There was a lot.
But the idea of this moral majority, this kind of this right-wing Christian movement had never delivered power to Washington before. Not to the presidency, and they claimed Ronald Reagan, and Ronald Reagan claimed them, and they really ushered in an era of ideology that we hadn't seen before. So
even though Carter was also appealed to this constituency, and was at the time was regarded as a religious right figure.
He was, but he didn't really appeal to the constituency. They were not. They did, although he considered himself an evangelical Christian, called himself that, and Ronald Reagan didn't call himself that. The evangelicals pulled behind Reagan for his, conservative social policies, which Carter did not embrace. Carter played a role in the 70s in the campaign. The Briggs campaign in California. Carter, I think he was running for president at the time, he was asked to make some sort of statement about it, and the Briggs campaign in California was a statewide initiative in 1977, I'm guessing, or 76, to bar gay people from teaching in schools, in public schools, gays and lesbians, and he spoke out against it. So if he had a second term,
Reagan did.
Yes.
Reagan did as well.
Wasn't Reagan instrumental in that going down, the Briggs Amendment going down to defeat?
I don't know this history. You say yes.
No.
I don't know that Reagan was.
No, he surprised everybody before that vote by saying that he was against it.
All right, so maybe we wouldn't have done better with Carter, but Carter was at least a single line in his philosophy that he what he said he meant and continued to believe as the years went by. So I don't know. So let's say that Carter stayed in office and didn't say anything aggressive about it, or may have been a little more compassionate about it. What we still had was Big Pharma not doing any research. We had, when the virus was discovered, we had this unseemly battle between scientists in this country and scientists in France, being fomented by the Reagan administration with some sense of kind of patriotic national pride, that slowed down research for a number of years. It slowed down the announcement of HIV having been discovered by at least 2 years. So that kept anybody from investing any money in trying to find a way to confront the virus. So there's all this other hideous shit that was happening, and no one was standing up to say, you've got to do something better. There was one guy actually, and I think he's like an unsung hero in all of this, and he was in charge of the National Cancer Institute at the NIH, Sam Broder. And Broder started traveling through the country, meeting with pharmaceutical researchers saying, you've got to start studying this virus. Even it was before it was called HIV. It was before the battle was finished between Bob Gallo and Luc Montagnier over ownership of this discovery. And nobody, no research, no pharmaceutical research lab would touch the virus. They were terrified of it, and they saw no upside to it.
They were physically terrified of dealing with it?
Yeah, they were very afraid of it. And they saw no upside, you know. So let's say we do risk our lives and find something to address this. Who's going to care? Because the victim toll didn't include anybody that we needed to care about. And so what Broder did, and it had never been done before in pharmaceutical research anywhere, he said that he would do the work with the virus, with the retrovirus in his laboratory at NCI, and he invited the corporations to bring compounds, and he would test them there to find out if any of the compounds had any efficacy against it. And then there was a protest at NCI that none of the staff wanted to be in the building while this research was going on. So he put together a team of volunteers, and they worked overnight to test thousands of potential compounds against HIV.
What year was that?
That was 84 and 85, and that's what brought us to AZT. It was he who discovered AZT's efficacy, and then once he did that, he gave it back to the company that had it, which was Burroughs Wellcome. Burroughs Wellcome had spent no money researching it. They had never touched the retrovirus, but they got really excited and put the thing into production and charged, at the time, the most money ever charged for a new drug, and they had there was no defense for it. There was no R&D in this compound, none, and they charged $10,000 a year for it.
Right.
So shit was bad.
Right.
Shit was bad back then, and yeah, you can say that this guy didn't lead and that guy didn't lead, but nobody led, and maybe we blame them all for that.
And they didn't. The drug companies didn't just see the profit in this. I mean, this was the stories are everywhere. This virus is spreading. I mean, they were alarmist at the time. They thought that every heterosexual would get it.
They didn't actually believe that, I don't think. Those were the headlines. They really believed that, and they had projections.
And they were right.
They had projections showing that this is really not going to be a profit center.
Right.
And then Burroughs Wellcome charges out at $10,000. Burroughs Wellcome, tripled revenues over the next 4 years, all on the back of AZT.
Did that encourage the other pharmaceutical companies to get in?
It did.
So again, weird unintended consequences.
Yeah. But what they went back to do is to try to create their own AZT, and AZT was a single approach to the virus. It was very plain early on that AZT had efficacy for at most 6 months.
Right.
And that none of the studies were conducted long enough to find out if it had any impact in life expectancy. And it took another almost decade of AZT's dominance in the marketplace, making that company incredible sums of money before it was allowed to, before the drug company allowed any research center to study the long-term effects of the drug. So in 1992, this study comes out, the Concord study, that proves that in fact it does nothing to extend life. It did nothing to extend life, and by that time, hundreds of millions of dollars were paid back to shareholders, and Burroughs Wellcome muscled out a lot of the other competitors from taking on that marketplace.
Let's have 2 more questions. Is there any parallel between the population that was a part of the HIV epidemic and the population that became subject to the meth epidemic, the crystal meth epidemic? Whether anybody studied the parallels there?
I started to say before that I was moved into this area of research, but having run into my old colleague, Dr. Gabriel Torres, and I sat him down before his trials and asked him to narrate his own journey. And he said that in 1996, and I talked a little bit before about this kind of removal of the excitement and urgency of this time. He lost his AIDS ward. By which I don't mean he lost it. I mean it emptied out. It emptied out. First he had a huge staff. He lost his staff psychiatrist. Like that was the first blow. And then he started losing people from his staff. And then the beds were empty. And then they finally said, we need your floor back. And that happened so quickly that that he didn't talk about that as being his motivation. He talked about the drug as being celebration. He suddenly had time. I mean, I remember walking through the village. He would walk through I knew what his window was. You could see him up there in that window. You could see him working. That he grew up in AIDS. He ran into his first patient during his first rotation in medical school and gave up his life to it and had developed no real adult life. He didn't have he didn't have a simple kind of ability. He didn't have anything. He didn't have a world. He didn't have anything to fall back on. So he went to the party, and the party took him to the clubs, and the clubs took him to more party. I've spoken to many people who have been through that period post '96, and they talk about the party. And I think, one of the things that meth tells you, and meth lies to you, it tells you that you have never quite been you before. And so there's this new moment, right? So suddenly there's this blinding light of day at the end of this period of mass death. And the drug, even on first tasting, can convince you never knew yourself. You never knew freedom. You never had, and this is an important part of it, you never had sex without fear and shame. And I think that was the party. It was the party that you could finally do that. But it grabs hold of you in a vicious way. And that's why I was putting it in the context of the people who are on the front lines, because those are the people who you would least expect to go into, some medical crisis because they had spent 10, 15 years fighting to get out of one. Those are the people who fell in most dramatically. It's still a problem today, obviously, but it was launched right then.
We never really did have a party, did we, to celebrate?
No.
There's that amazing scene at the end of Long Time Companion,
right?
Which is, I always gets me every time when everybody who died comes back for the final party. There was no VE day. There was no victory parade. It was just disappeared. And there was actually at the end, I experienced this by writing that.
I was going to say,
New York Times piece.
You were the person who saw the watershed.
Right.
And I think no one else did. And that's why you took heat for that piece. When Andrew wrote a piece in the Times in '96, the summer of '96, I think.
Yeah, When Plagues End. Called
When Plagues End, that drew the line, that said there was a before and now we are in the after. And none of the activists wanted to accept that, or were too afraid to accept that at that point. And I, as a journalist, was not at all convinced that we had celebrations before, and so people couldn't see that, and in fact condemned you for trying to make them see it.
Right.
And you couple that with the fact that there's something just wrong about rejoicing after a period like that. Could you rejoice after being freed from the camps? Could you ever?
I didn't argue at the time for rejoicing, by the way.
Right,
but
I know.
No, but it was, yeah. Maybe it was of the nature of this thing, that it couldn't have a moment where we could take stock. But the consequence of that is that it's in our heads today.
Right.
And it's still
Locked.
rippling throughout. I'm sorry, we're going to have to make this one last call from Tim because he won't forgive me.
I'd like to actually start where you, go back to where you started from. What's the future? You're obviously an assimilationist. You wanted to be an outlaw. The generation and everything we're talking about is not touching the 19 and 18 and 17-year-olds outside of those becoming infected with HIV. My point is their world is entirely different. What's the future of gay men?
Well, I wrote.
Thank you for coming, everybody.
What did you say? I missed what you said. I'm
I just
sorry.
said thank you for coming, everybody.
Yes, no, it's true.
Do you have an answer for that?
I wrote another article that was well received in the gay community called "The End of Gay Culture," which I did that in 2005, because I can see that gay culture, called gay culture, was created in part, not entirely, in part, and it's been fascinating to observe this from, first of all, those in the past who had no option but to be seen as homosexual. In other words, the more effeminate or the more obvious, the people who fit certain paradigms, and they were the one, and so many others were completely closeted or called themselves normals or whatever, or did this occasionally or whatever. So that created a certain specific, and then that became, of course, radicalized politically in the 70s. But I think that kind of culture existed for centuries, so far as we can tell. Very hard to find evidence of it for obvious reasons. But that once the moment of integration happened, because specifically gay kids are brought up in straight families, in general, overwhelmingly, and their first knowledge of what being gay is will come in from the general culture. They won't have their parents sit them down and say, well, you're a gay man now, so this is what happens when you're 17, and this is what happens when you're 25. You don't have those talks. You have to figure it out from will and fucking grace, you know? I mean, but that would mean also that my view is that once that kid going through those, because I think it'll always be the case, the gay kids will have a hard time, by and large. Not everybody will have a hard time at some point, internally or externally. The marriage question, the settlement of marriage, which equates their future with that of their parents or their siblings, removes, or at least prevents, a massive wound to the psyche. In other words, helps a much healthier development because you don't have quite as much. You still have some, but quite as much trauma. And therefore, the difference between gay culture and the rest is going to be attenuated to some extent. Also, because so many of the people that were not obviously identified as gay in the past then became gay, openly gay, and then so you then had a greater diversity of public presentation of the varieties, and God knows there are many varieties of gay men, and that large amount of those gay men are very hard to tell from straight men, and then you also have technology, which of course has destroyed the gay culture, pub, bar life that created this physical space in which generations mixed, in which gay men were able to talk to one another and have those incidental encounters that were not about getting laid, which is why you went there in the first place, but were just things that happened along the way, that you picked up this thing. It was always changing. There's nothing static about this, it seems to me, but that's been destroyed by the apps. And this little town is in some ways it's been fascinating to come here now for almost 25 years, 23 summers that I've spent here, Three more than this? 20 summers. Anyway, 23 summers here. And watch it. I mean, many of you remember, this was the only place for gay men to come, really. And you remember the 80s, I mean, this place was just jammed. The Spiritus line went from, almost from the boat slip down to the town hall, right? I mean, I didn't hallucinate that. And it was also a lot of different classes, a lot of different backgrounds. You met all sorts of people you wouldn't otherwise meet. And now it's, obviously completely different. And even the gay bars are now, because of integration, bachelorette parties and so on, that's be careful what you ask for, because you'll get bachelorette parties completely killing the vibe it's true, it does.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
I highly disagree with that statement.
they're killing the vibe?
Yes, I do.
Really?
I do, because I take it a little bit personally, because if a bunch of women want to go hang out in a gay club like Boat Slip and have a great time and dance and drink and get drunk and hang out with their gay friends, I don't see why gay men should take offense to that.
I don't think they necessarily take offense to it, but the atmosphere changes dramatically within
What atmosphere changes?
an all-male atmosphere.
But why, the Boat Slip is not an all-male
Well, I'm not
club.
thinking of the boat slip, to be honest with you.
Well, A House is not an all-male club.
No one's saying they should be forbidden. I'm just saying that didn't used to be the case. These were all male spaces that suddenly became very different. And that's a difference. I'm not saying it's better or worse, but it certainly undermines and changes what we thought of as gay male culture, which is you go into a place, there'd be no one but gay men there. That you knew.
When I was coming here in the 80s, we went to all the clubs together. We went to the A House, we went to the Boat Slip, we went to the Crown, we went to all these clubs.
Were women a majority of the people in this?
Lesbians I'm talking about, not straight girl bachelorettes. But I find that the and I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but I find that that statement has been perpetuated in the last couple of years, that the gay men at the Boat Slip don't want groups of women coming to the Boat Slip during tea dance. They have an aversion to these girls coming and having a good time. And I'm one of those girls in the sense that I love to go out with my gay male friends and have a great time, and with my girlfriends.
We're talking about
But-
groups of 20, 30 women from a straight bachelorette party
Right.
that enter in one go.
Right.
So what?
There's very little integration
Right.
in that group, and I think that's the issue at hand. But I think that's a slice of our life today.
Right.
There's no integration of it for anything.
Well, anyway, I don't want to completely shift the conversation.
The question is, how does what is the state of health education today, and as life-saving? AIDS, isn't really taught anymore, and it's as though it went away. It's as though HIV went away, and that's true not just in secondary school, but in universities. I've been surprised to find out that the film How to Survive a Plague is being taught as AIDS history, and it's really just a movie, and it's a movie in which, I'll confess to you all, things are taken out of order in order to make it feel more like a movie. So I don't like the idea that people are filling blue books with answers about How to Survive a Plague, the film, and but also the film is being taught at master's programs for public health. Where is this history, and what do we need to know this history for? Certainly we need to know what could happen, what did happen, and how to keep it from happening again. And I guess going back to our first question, how do you keep alive the idea of loving yourself enough, to teaching people to love themselves enough to keep healthy and to keep the people around them healthy, and I think that's really the power of education, especially for young people, If we're missing that opportunity by just taking that out of the curriculum, we've made a big mistake.
Thank you so much for coming.